Okay everyone, sorry it's taken me a while to get this video up and going. It's been an incredibly busy week, busy semester, as I assume it has been for all of y'all. But welcome again if you were joining me. My name is Dr. Joshua Martin, and I am recording these series of videos for my Young Harris College dual enrollment class. All right, today I want to talk about Bartleby the Scrivener, a longish yet analytically and emotionally important story for a number of reasons. One of which is that it falls under this week's discussion of Marxism and class. Fundamentally, this is a tale about a protagonist who is impoverished and is in many ways a cog in a machine. Now, what does he do for a living? He is a scrivener, which is a legal copyist. So he spends his days copying legal documents from the narrator, who is a lawyer. Now, some things to note at the beginning. Bartleby the Scrivener, we have his name. The secondary title is The Story of Wall Street. Now, if you don't know what Wall Street is, it's a famous business and financial district in New York City, home of the New York Stock Exchange and other financial institutions. So we have the idea of capitalism embedded immediately in the story. Marxist thought, Marxist criticism, literary criticism as well, looks at the ways in which capitalism alienates the individual. And to break it down, we can think of how capitalism operates, right? One of the guiding principles of capitalism, if not the guiding principle, is the accumulation of capital. Capital, i.e. wealth, money, etc. Capitalism works if there are people capitalists who own the modes of production and people who work for the capitalists who generate revenue. Now, in the process of that generation of revenue, workers must obviously work. And that repetitive work, day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out, working for someone else generating money, can be very alienating and isolating. Again, I'm saying this from a purely Marxist perspective, and so on and so forth. So we get a character in Bartleby who is a hard worker at first, right? He's hired on, and he comes into an office with a copyist named Turkey, an older copyist named Turkey, and Nippers, a younger copyist, and then finally Gingernut, who seems to be kind of the office secretary or page boy. And at first, he is working, Bartleby the Scrivener is, he's one of the best copyists they have, producing loads and loads and loads and loads of good copy. However, as things go on, Bartleby the Scrivener becomes more and more sullen. Now, I can't go through this entire story as it is long, but I just want to touch on the bigger picture. As Bartleby becomes more and more alienated just by the mechanization of his life, just the routinization, constantly having to repeat, constantly copying, which is a deadening job, right? He's not producing any new knowledge, he's merely copying. He gets very alienated and isolated. And in fact, the office itself mirrors this isolation. We get the walls of the office, which mirror the walls of the jail cell at the end when he is imprisoned in tombs. Whenever the narrator asks Bartleby to do anything, or to leave, or if he wants anything, Bartleby responds with the famous, "I would prefer not to." Now, what does this mean? Well, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward, I would prefer not to do anything, right? The question becomes, why does he say, "I would prefer not to"? On one hand, Bartleby is the classic depressed person, right? And at the end, his depression comes full circle. He refuses to eat. He's lost all motivation to survive. One could trace the deadening work that he does to this sense of alienation from his job, right? Imagine having to work constantly, right? You work, you go home, you eat dinner, you go back to work, you work, you go home, you eat dinner, you go back, and you work, you go home, and you eat dinner. After a while, that repetition without meaning, without growth, becomes very deadening, becomes very isolating. It's not hard to see how somebody like Bartleby can lose all interest in doing anything, right? If his life is just one big going from work and copying, and he's actually not going home, he's sleeping at the office, because he is presumably very poor, one could see how that's a very dull and boring and ultimately meaningless life for Bartleby. And plenty of people do this, right? And so one could say that his work is leading him into depression. And so the question becomes, from Marx's analysis, what is the role of capitalism in totally alienating somebody like Bartleby until the point when they view life as meaningless and futile? And I think, as we already said, Bartleby's work, his labor, his production, he exists solely to work, solely to benefit the narrator's business. He is completely isolated from his other co-workers. He's isolated from the business and the money. And more importantly, he grows isolated from himself, right? So at first, when he's just saying, I prefer not to copy, it eventually becomes, I prefer not to engage in more fundamental basic human needs, like eating, like, growing and sleeping and things like that, right? He's living in the apartment. And so again, as you're going through the story, I want you to think about the role that Bartleby's poverty plays in his depression, right? He is not leaving the apartment, not out of his own volition, but because he doesn't have the means to get an actual apartment. So this weighs on him. So when I asked him the question, analyze from Marx's perspective, I want you to think about his class. He is a poor scrivener who is living in Wall Street, this place of incredible wealth, and working in Wall Street. So we have a contradiction, a juxtaposition. And so as we go through, we can see just traces of his poverty and how it leads to his depression. So what might Melville's thesis statement be if we had to write on this essay? And hopefully some of y'all will. Well, a thesis statement might say that in Bartleby the Scrivener, Melville uses imagery, he also uses metaphor, allegory, imagery, to suggest that capitalism, to suggest that the dullness of life and working leads to alienation, right? Notice how we're going deeper than just giving a plot summary. We're looking at the philosophical and economic and political implications behind the work. Again, guys, this is a longer work, so hopefully you were able to read some, pieces, 10 pages here, 10 pages there. But again, as you're going through, pay attention to instances where Bartleby is described as poor, instances where he's described as depressed, and put those together, his class and his mental instability, as a product of his social isolation, right? There seems to be the undercurrent that capitalism, the way it is, especially in the mid-19th century when this is written, is tied to social alienation, alienation from the world, and more importantly, alienation from yourself. Okay, thanks, y'all.